Last night, Russia carried out one of its heaviest strikes in months, targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure with almost 500 aerial weapons, including Shahed drones, Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, and multiple types of ballistic rockets. Ukraine's air defense intercepted the majority, but several regions remain without power and water. The question now is not only military, but how should Ukraine respond politically, especially as global attention shifts elsewhere. Joining me now is Stanislav Belkovsky, political analyst. Stanislav, it's always a pleasure to have you here in our studio.
Hello, and thank you for your invitation, as usual.
Stanislav, so how do you see the proper and right political response to such an attack from the Kremlin, and how would you assess actually the current political stance of the Ukrainian president on the international stage?
The situation is rather complicated, of course, because the objective of Vladimir Putin and Kremlin are quite clear. And it's lead to Ukraine to the attrition and to the highest level of exhaustion, to make Ukrainian power, Ukrainian elites discuss the conditions of semi-surrender handed over through Donald Trump during Putin-Trump Anchorage meeting in the middle of August. And that's why Putin is increasing its military activities and military pressure onto Ukraine. Of course, Donald Trump does not show any willingness and readiness to strengthen its pressure onto Putin. He's not about new sanctions against Russia. The question of tomahawks and its delivery to Ukraine is still suspended. Those rumors about tomahawks handed over to Netherlands, in my opinion, have nothing to do with any real prospects of getting tomahawks rapidly enough in Ukraine, because it's a long procedure, and Ukraine doesn't have ground-based systems to launch tomahawk from Netherlands or through any other channel indirectly from the US. And the United States, of course, is now doesn't show any willingness to supply Ukraine with specialists, American specialists, military specialists, quite necessary to use such kind of missiles against Russia. But it's a question of European unity around the idea and matter of Ukrainian support, because of course, Ukraine as United Europe is preparing itself for the large-scale war with Russian Federation. And regardless of how probable such war is in the nearest future, this way is inevitable and inescapable. This potential war with Russia becomes a unifying idea of the United Europe, which should help it to go through the wave of crises, including economy one. And to this very point, Ukraine, of course, is very necessary for United Europe as avant-garde of this fighting. At the same time, of course, Ukraine needs a lot of money. The question of financial crisis becomes one of the key issues in the modern reality. The budget deficit amounting to 60 billion euros for the year 2025 should be covered by European allies, because there is no more hope on American ones. And another 60 billion euros, another tranche is a military assistance that should be fully covered by European countries as well, because there is no hope Donald Trump would provide any financial support. The good thing, I think the advantage is that the United States has not refused to provide Ukraine with intelligence information free of charge, not billing it. But we still don't know how far it would last. And that's why the idea is to unite Europe about this concept, that if Ukraine is usually defeated, if Ukraine is forced to meet Putin's Alaska conditions, let's call them such, so it would be next stage for Europe to get prepared for the new war, new stage of war, direct war with Russian Federation. How successful the Ukrainian political leadership would be in providing this idea and in keeping all the Europe united, especially taking into consideration some political changes coming to power of politicians like Andrei Babic and Czechia, for instance, we'll see in coming weeks and months. But the key question is not just diplomacy. The key question is how reliable the Ukrainian defense line is, and how far and how long Ukraine can stand under this growing military pressure from Kremlin side.
Yes. And as long as you mentioned Tomahawk deliveries from the US to Ukraine, and it seems like they've been put on hold, how could their presence, even just 2 or 3, change, the global political landscape?
I don't think the presence of Tomahawks could change the situation militarily 100%. Of course, it's rather an expensive weapon. One Tomahawk's unit is worth $2 million. By the way, the announced Ukrainian-produced missile Flamingo should be 4 times cheaper, but we still don't know how ready Flamingos are. We've heard that already 50 Flamingos per month are produced, but how reliable this information is, it's still not fully clear. But even the decision itself to hand Tomahawks to Ukraine, bringing Tomahawks to Ukraine, should be the considerable psychological impact on the situation and onto Vladimir Putin, who is still not going to quarrel with Donald Trump, who is still hopeful that Donald Trump is the best American president possible for him, and pins his greatest hopes on future business pact with Donald Trump, involving natural resources of Russian Siberia and Arctics, Northern Sea route, and so on and so forth. And that's why, if Putin understands and Trump has decided it, so Putin will understand at the same time that the United States are getting back to the coalition of Ukraine's friend, and United States are turning to the new stage of pressure into Russia. So psychologically, it would be very important, because Putin is a businessman by his psychology. He counts his resources. He would never launch this aggression, full-scale aggression, against Ukraine in February 2022 if he had known that the war would last more than 3 years and a half. And now, of course, he cannot afford to get the United States as enemy again.
Yeah, so he could not just predict that Ukrainians will show that type of resistance.
Yes, this first and foremost, the spirit of resistance.
Yeah.
This readiness to resist the aggressor, because Putin was quite sure that the majority of Ukrainian population and the majority of Ukrainian elites, first and foremost, would surrender.
Yeah.
Would prefer the peaceful life under pro-Putin's authoritarian regime in Kiev to full-scale war.
Yeah. Stanislav, I see some messages coming from the Washington, D.C., from the White House regarding the Nobel Prize. So I just want to shift to that topic as well. So Donald Trump did not get the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize. It went instead to Maria Machado, a Venezuelan opposition leader, and she's a longtime fighter for democracy and freedom in her country. Do you think this decision... Well, I wanted to ask, do you think this decision disappointed Trump, which it obviously did, but could it actually somehow affect his attitude towards Russian war in Ukraine?
It could affect his attitude toward Europe.
Yeah.
Though Norway is not a member of European Union, and Norwegian Nobel Committee is fully, which I can quite believe, 100% independent on Norwegian powers, though being appointed by Norwegian parliament. But Donald Trump does not understand such nuances. For him, it's all Europe, and for him, this Nobel Prize is a political move against him. Though the Nobel Committee tried to be cunning and sly enough by choosing the Venezuelan politician, knowing and emphasizing that Venezuela is another priority battlefield for Donald Trump himself, because Donald Trump promised to bring democracy to Venezuela and, in my opinion, is quite prepared for military invasion onto this country to topple the authoritarian and this drug cartel de los Soles regime of Nicolas Maduro and its allies. And it was postponed by this 10th of October because Donald Trump didn't want to launch the invasion before the Nobel Prize winner would be proclaimed, because starting new wars is something against ethically and aesthetically to status of Nobel Prize winner, Peace Nobel Prize winner. But of course, regardless of those considerations, regardless that Donald Trump cannot disapprove Venezuelan democratic politician whom he has to support according to his priority line toward Venezuela and its governing regime. Of course, the American president is bitterly disappointed. And he could never understand. He's dealing like a big businessman, according to the logic depicted in his book, Art of the Deal, published in first version of it had been published in 1987. And he was too aggressive toward Nobel Committee. He was too outspoken in his willingness to get the prize. And of course, it's fully against the ethics of the prize itself. And the Polymarket platform has given to Trump just 4% of probability of getting the prize. And this morning, today, Friday morning, Polymarket, which is still considered as a very reliable forecast vehicle, had given 70% for Ms. Machado of Venezuela. So it was more or less understandable. But of course, Trump now was very irritated and annoyed with Europe, which he doesn't like at all, because European politicians, the majority of European leaders, have been against him. And in his opinion, were against his coming to power in 2016, against his staying in power in 2020 and getting back to power in 2024. And for Donald Trump, who is already 79 and we still are not quite sure about the reliability of his health, especially cognitive one, despite, of course, his so vivid lifestyle. Donald, for him, the agenda of revenge to all enemies, to all who did not support him, who also supported him as a threat for democracy and so on, is a very important part of this presidential term. And the revenge to Europe and European leaders as well, among those positions of his priority agenda. That's why I don't expect anything favorable from Donald Trump with regard to today's Nobel Committee decision, though understanding that Nobel Committee had no way out. He could not afford itself to grant Donald Trump this prize, though, properly speaking, Donald Trump deserves maybe not the Nobel Prize, which he's not very compatible with for several considerations, for several reasons. But of course, as a peacekeeper, he deserves a great respect for such moves like such projects like Abraham Accords, for instance, of 2020, yes, which, in my opinion, is a strategic outline, not just for Middle East, but for the humanity at all, and maybe the international organization, including military lines, which maybe could be built around the Abraham Accords after their broadening in coming years, could replace the United Nations organization to a very considerable extent, also in coming years. Donald Trump deserves, of course, our applauses for the normalization of the majority, which suddenly happened after he was re-elected American president in November 2024. Like Barack Obama deserves the Nobel Prize for the full normalization and destigmatization of minorities. So in the same way, Trump deserves it as well. But of course, he was a little bit both aggressive and naive about this hope at any rate and at all price, at any price, to get the Nobel Prize this year.
Yeah, naive, that's a very good word for that. Have you seen yesterday's press conference of the president of Finland and the US president, how Stubb was caught by surprise when the journalists were asking whether the American president is deserved to get the Nobel Peace Prize? And the answer of Stubb was hilarious, how he was trying to answer properly, honestly, sitting in front of the Donald Trump and still trying to give him, I don't know, maybe some idea that it's still not enough. I don't know, but that was, the response was super diplomatic, just, have you seen it?
So on one hand, Alexander Stubb realized quite well that Donald Trump could hardly get the prize. On another hand, Alexander Stubb is trying to present himself as an informal leader of United Europe and dialogue with Trump.
Yes.
Because for him, it's more comfortable than for leaders like Emmanuel Macron, for instance, or German leaders, because he's a newcomer, new face on the European political stage, and he's a golf player, and for Donald Trump is an important part of his image. Though, as you remember, Donald Trump did not even recognize Alexander Stubb during the collective meeting with European leaders at White House 2 months ago. But I connected more with this cognitive problems of aging American president, rather than with his demonstrative unwillingness to do so. No, and of course, Alexander Stubb now and they are discussing different business commercial projects between US and Finland, including icebreakers, contrary to competing to Chinese ones. And so I think the Alexander Stubb position at all concerning the big war in Ukraine, big war in Europe, is the most balanced and reasonable. Alexander Stubb emphasizes remembering the destiny of its own country in 1940s, that what is the basic criteria of victory? The basic criteria of victory to keep the independence and the identity of the country, the opportunity to stay inside the free world, rather than the control over the conquered territory. And this idea of how to put stop to this big war, coming from Alexander Stubb, is quite well, in my opinion. It's quite aligns with the realistic concept what should be achieved, rather than 1991 borders of Ukraine. And as a negotiator, as a mediator, as the keeper of the very reasonable concept, Alexander Stubb could be very helpful to Ukraine and Europe in its dialogue, in his dialogue with Trump, of course. So let's protect Alexander Stubb from any risks and threats coming in this hardly predictable dialogue. So Trump is predictable not in concrete moves, but at the level of his motivation, which is quite clear. The basic point of his motivation is a glory. He's going to be someone called GOAT, is greatest of all times. And he will do his best to be greatest of all times, even regardless of the key positions of his MAGA supporters, Make America Great Again camp, where the isolationist wing of this camp is completely against any US involvement in the wars outside America, including the questions of Israel, Middle East, and so on. And this MAGA isolationist wing, represented by such remarkable persons like Tucker Carlson, Stephen Bannon, and some others, now is increasing his pressure onto Trump to get America away from all those conflicts. And one considerable part of this campaign is anti-Semitic one, because getting back to the America First movement emerged in America at the beginning of 20th century. The second wave of this America First was in 1930s and late 1930s, before the Second World War. And before the Second World War, this America First movement, represented by such bright leaders like Charles Lindbergh, for instance, or young Gerald Ford, the future American president, they insisted that there are three forces willing to involve the United States contrary to their basic interests, to the Second World War. The Great Britain, the Englishmen, who do not want to keep the burden of this war just themselves, just on their own. Jews, who wants America to protect them. So it was anti-Semitic from the previous stages as well. And the democratic administration of Franklin Roosevelt. After Pearl Harbor, after this outburst, the America First movement actually ceased to exist. But now it's revived, and Donald Trump, of course, would be, to a certain extent, resist this pressure, because he still does want to be the GOAT. And being the GOAT, becoming the GOAT is impossible without America's involvement in international conflicts and protecting the American allies, even conditional ones, like Europe. But at the same time of this conservative camp of his supporters, on which he's very dependent with regard to interim Congress elections of 2026.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that efforts and diplomatic approach of the president of Finland is priceless. And so I completely agree with your point of view. And I just want to ask you...
This experience of survival and,
probably.
And this fighting with totalitarian superpower of Finland is unique.
Yes, absolutely true, actually. And I just wanted to switch to another meeting that also happened yesterday, I guess. The Russian leader Russian dictator Putin met with Azerbaijani president Ilham Aliyev in Dushanbe. And that was their first meeting in almost a year. And for me, there was a question that remains. Who was needed this meeting most?
I think for Putin it was more important. That's why he agreed to meet in Dushanbe in the summit of Russia Central Asia. By the way, so as not to forget it, Putin has planned a summit Russian Arabic world for the 15th of October. And right today we found out that the summit is cancelled, at least postponed for some indefinite terms. So Arab countries prefer to talk to Trump during his visit to Middle East next week, not to Putin and Moscow.
Yes.
Another diplomatic defeat of Kremlin host, of Russian tyrant. But the dialogue, as we know from Azerbaijani media of today, it's this dialogue between Ilham Aliyev and Vladimir Putin in Dushanbe is considered by Azerbaijani parties the victory of Baku. 100% full-scale victory, and it's emphasized that Putin has met all the Ilham Aliyev's conditions. We should not forget that the Azerbaijani lobby in Russia is very strong. Yes, some semi-criminal elements, some marginal elements in different regions of Russia have been arrested, and maybe some of them would be set free. Now we observe just this one-for-one exchange. In Moscow has been set free the former director of Russian Moscow Satire Theater, Mamed Agaev, in response for the Russian propagandist working in Baku. But funny enough that both are Russian citizens, not Azerbaijani. So it's an exchange between one Russian citizen for another one. But Azerbaijan shows that he's no more interested in any empire metropolis and does not consider Russia as a senior partner, as it had been just 20 years ago. Azerbaijan shows the model of how such a country, not very large, not in terms of territory nor population, but self-sufficient, both in terms of economy and military force, can act in the modern world which emerges from the debris of America-centered world. How to do it under the conditions of this global fragmentation, where everyone is just for itself. And Azerbaijan shows it as being not a huge country, how to resist Russia and how to be on equal terms with the former empire. and even to outplay the shrewdest and wittiest dictator as Vladimir Putin is depicted by his cronies. Because Azerbaijan is in the law of Turkey on one hand, of Israel, very difficult relationship with Turkey on another hand. At the same time, provides its influence over Central Asia and resists Russia to the utmost, using this Azerbaijan lobby, but it's still very influential despite this conflict in Russia. Russia doesn't have any kind of such pro-Moscow lobby in Azerbaijan at all. So I think the initiative belongs to Baku, and the meeting in Dushanbe has not changed this perception.
Yes. So for the end, I want to ask another interesting news that coming from the Europe, actually. So there was maybe yesterday, just when Hungary is signaling that it might give up Russian gas. Slovakia is against still, but Hungary, maybe a little of a, we see like they're not giving up, but, just doing something good, probably. Can we consider this as a small victory over Orban, or I'm not understanding that correctly?
No, though being to a certain extent European dissident, Viktor Orban is a businessman as well.
Okay.
His basic idea to keep the power.
Yeah.
Now the situation for him is not too favorable, because according to polls, he might lose the general elections next spring. Though, of course, as the leader with some authoritarian approaches, I don't expect Viktor Orban just to meet this defeat easily, like Recep Tayyip Erdogan or Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. Not to talk about Vladimir Putin, he would do its best to keep the power, even in some non-democratic ways, I think. Let's see. But at the same time, he's not leading Hungary out of European Union. He's bargaining. He wants to get large-scale compensation for the European unity, for his personal loyalty and the loyalty of Budapest. And I think if this compensation would be offered to Hungary, Hungary would be with some tensions, with some grief, but agree to European conditions as far as Russian oil and gas are concerned.
So basically, he just wants to stay in power for as long as possible.
It's his primary goal, and all his other steps, moves are subject to this goal, are secondary to this goal.
Yeah. Okay. Stanislav, thank you so much for being with us, for spending time with us, and see you next time.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's usually entirely at your disposal. Bye-bye.
Thank you.